Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to plunge into, well, frankly, a massive amount of information, complex data streams, and really extract the crucial knowledge you need to be properly informed.
That's right.
Today, we're zeroing in on Bihar. It's often called India's political laboratory of democracy, and for good reason. It's one of the most unpredictable, electorally vital states, and we're looking at it right after its assembly elections on November 11th, 2025. The results aren't officially out yet, but the exit polls, well, they're telling a story.
They really are. And look, this deep dive isn't just about, counting seats. This feels like a moment of real democratic significance for India. We've got this huge stack of sources, exit polls, analysis of the likely mandate, and maybe most importantly, the economic backdrop that really frames every single vote cast.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to connect those dots. We need to unpack what the exit polls are saying, the consensus view, anyway, then analyze the architecture of the winning side as projected, and then, crucially, put that political picture in the context of Bihar's economic story. I mean, this is a state that's been fighting tooth and nail to shed that old BIMARU label.
Yeah, an awful term, yeah. For the backward states.
Exactly. And now it's consistently posting some of the fastest GSDP growth rates in the entire country. So the big question is, did the politics, in the end, validate the economic narrative, or maybe vice versa?
That is absolutely the core question we need to tackle. And what the sources show right off the bat is this really strong, almost overwhelming consensus across nearly all the major pollsters. We're talking Matriz, Chanakya Strategies, PMark, you name it. They're all pointing towards a pretty decisive, perhaps even unshakable victory for the incumbent National Democratic Alliance, the NDA.
Okay, decisive, a clear victory projected. But you also hear this phrase, the sources mention it, renewal and repetition. And Bihar, well, it has a history of making pollsters look a bit silly, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It humbles them. Our source material really hammers home this underlying volatility, the unpredictability of Bihar's electoral soil. They point to specific major polling failures. Think back to 2015 or even 2020. The predictions were way off.
Right. So even if the polls are singing from the same hymn sheet this time, the actual result on November 14th is still a test, isn't it? A test of whether this kind of political machine can finally bring stability to what's historically been a very turbulent democratic process there.
And that inherent volatility is exactly why we have to dissect this projected mandate really carefully with a critical eye. Look, this deep dive, it isn't just an academic exercise for us or for you listening. It's about understanding what looks like a reaffirmation of a kind of state-level social contract. The political outcome being predicted, which points towards continuity, towards stability, seems inextricably tied to this economic narrative of, well, rapid growth, rising aspirations, and this sense of developmental security that the NDA alliance has been carefully constructing for, almost 2 decades now.
2 decades, yeah.
We absolutely have to understand how those two ideas, stability and aspiration, seem to have become mutually reinforcing in the minds of Bihar's voters.
Okay. Let's get into it then.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the basics, the foundational stuff, the numbers. What are these exit polls actually projecting? What's the consensus figure dominating the headlines right now?
Well, the consensus is frankly pretty striking. It's very one-sided. The Bihar Assembly has 243 seats, right? So you need 122 for a simple majority.
122, yeah.
Across the board, the average projection puts the NDA comfortably clear of that. We're talking somewhere around 147 seats. That's a cushion of what? Nearly 25 seats above the magic number. It suggests a solid working majority.
147. That's a significant mandate if it actually pans out that way. It would give the alliance a much stronger position than they had after the 2020 election, which was pretty tight, wasn't it?
It was very tight, yes. This suggests a much clearer verdict. And on the flip side, the opposition Mahagathbandhi, the MGB, well, they're projected to be quite far behind. The numbers seem to be settling around the 90-seat mark for them.
90 seats, so a clear gap.
A very clear gap. And, our sources show this tight clustering of forecasts from the big agencies. Matriz, for example, they often have slightly higher estimates. They're projecting the NDA in the range of 147 to 167 seats. PMark is a bit more conservative, maybe 142 to 162. And even Chanakya Strategies, which sometimes leans more cautious, they're still forecasting 130 to 138 for the NDA. Still well above that majority line.
Okay, so a strong consensus there. But I did see one outlier. It really jumped out. Poll Diary. They projected something almost unbelievable, like 184 to 209 seats for the NDA. I mean, that kind of dominance. It feels almost impossible in Bihar's usually fragmented politics.
Yeah, poll diary is definitely an extreme outlier here, and we should probably treat it as such, with a fair bit of caution. But even if you discount those really high sweeping numbers, the core conclusion doesn't change. Even the most conservative, the most trusted estimates are forecasting a strong, stable NDA government, likely securing a mandate that's significantly stronger than their quite contested win back in 2020. The message seems to be that voters opted for stability.
Stability, okay. But let's look beyond just the seat projections for a moment, because there's another number here that the sources say tells a really important story, the turnout. A record 67% turnout. That's the highest ever in Bihar's electoral history. That's not just a statistic, is it? The sources argue it's like evidence of democracy really deepening its roots there.
Oh, absolutely. That surge in people coming out to vote, that's the real engine behind this projected result. And when you drill down, when you ask where did that surge come from, the answer seems pretty clear. Women voters.
Ah, the famous silent vote bank.
Exactly. They've been seen as Chief Minister Nitish Kumar's secret constituency, his silent vote bank for, gosh, almost 2 decades now. And this election, it looks like that loyalty might have just completely solidified. They seem to have turned out in force.
Can you help us and our listeners understand why? Why is this loyalty so strong, so enduring? The sources suggest it's not about grand ideology or national politics necessarily, but about very tangible, very practical government schemes. Is that right?
That's precisely it. You have to look at the welfare architecture that Nitish Kumar's administration, often in partnership with the BJP at the center, has built over the years. Schemes like Jivika, that's the big rural livelihoods project, the self-help group movement. It empowered millions of women, giving them access to microcredit, a source of income, a community.
Okay, Jivika, what else?
Then there's the Mukhyamantri Cycle Yojana, giving bicycles to schoolgirls. It sounds simple, but it dramatically increased school enrollment for girls, gave them mobility, independence, a sense of possibility. It was revolutionary in its time.
The cycle scheme. Yes, I remember the impact that had. And the other big one the sources mentioned is the liquor ban enforcement.
Ah, yes. The liquor ban. It's controversial nationally, perhaps, but in Bihar, it's woven this incredibly powerful, gendered moral narrative around governance.
How so? A moral narrative.
Well, look, for women, particularly in rural Bihar, the sources explain that governance is intensely practical. It's very local. It means things like, are the streets safe? Can I get my rations reliably from the PDS shop? Are the roads good enough to get to the market or the health center? And critically, with the liquor ban, it meant for many a perceived reduction in domestic violence, less household money being wasted on alcohol. The state, personified by Nitish Kumar, was seen by many women as a kind of patriarchal protector, someone who delivered basic security and necessities.
So, the thinking is, these women voters are choosing continuity not out of, say, political apathy, but based on a very hard-headed, practical calculation about their family's well-being and security. Their vote is like a reaffirmation of that local social contract.
That seems to be the core conclusion emerging from the analysis. This apparent confidence in the NDA alliance isn't just about, Modi's national popularity or big political waves. It seems fundamentally rooted in a validation of this nearly 2-decade-long strategy of focusing on gender-centric policy. It suggests that, for this very large group of voters, continuity delivered tangible personal benefits right at the most fundamental level of the household.
It's a compelling argument, but, and there's always a but with Bihar, we have to remember that warning from the sources. This state is anything but predictable. It's famous for humbling pollsters. We can't just ignore that history of volatility, can we?
No, absolutely not. We have to keep that caution front and center. Let's just recall those specific examples. In 2015, remember, almost every single pollster predicted an NDA victory. And what happened? The Nitish Lalu Mahagathbandhan swept the state. Completely wrong-footed everyone.
I remember that. Yeah, a huge upset.
And even more recently, in 2020, the initial forecasts really underestimated the NDA's ability to bounce back and eventually form the government, albeit with a thin majority. Bihar just keeps throwing curveballs.
Which brings us to the fundamental question, why? Why is Bihar so notoriously difficult to poll accurately? What makes it defy the neat statistical models?
The sources point to, broadly, 3 main structural reasons. First, that very high turnout we just talked about. While it's great for democracy, it also masks a lot of underlying volatility. Even small shifts, maybe among young voters or first-timers, or the movement of just one small but crucial caste group, those can swing, 20 or 30 seats just like that. And that's often the difference between a squeaker and a landslide.
Okay, high turnout, highest volatility. What's the second factor? I suspect it's the C word.
It absolutely is. Caste. The sheer, almost bewildering complexity of Bihar's layered caste system just resists easy statistical categorization. You've got the MGB's traditional core vote bank, the Yadavs and Muslims, but then there's the Kurmis, Nitish Kumar's community. There's the huge, diverse Dalit population, including Paswans, Musahars, and others. And then there's that massive, highly fragmented, and politically decisive bloc. The extremely backward classes, the EBCs.
Right, the EBCs. For listeners who might not be as familiar with the intricacies of Indian political demographics, can you just frame why the EBCs are so critical in Bihar?
Certainly. The EBCs, or extremely backward classes, are this vast heterogeneous collection of castes. Historically, they were marginalized even within the larger OBC or other backward classes category. They make up a huge chunk of the electorate, maybe close to 30%. They are, in many ways, the ultimate swing voters in Bihar.
And Nitish Kumar's success has been built on appealing to them specifically.
Largely, yes. For decades, they were politically almost invisible, fragmented. Nitish Kumar very consciously cultivated a sense of dignity among EBCs, targeted welfare specifically at them, gave them representation. He treated them as a distinct political force that deserved focus. They became the anchor, the bedrock of stability for his party, the JDU, holding firm even when other groups might swing.
Okay, so the sheer number of these groups and the complex interactions between them, that makes polling incredibly difficult.
Precisely. Tracking the micro-movements within these groups, how they align and realign, it's like trying to map shifting sands. Statistical models are always playing catch-up with the ground reality. So yes, the exit polls are painting a picture of strong stability, of continuity, but Bihar's deep political DNA, its history, it just whispers caution. The sources end this section with a necessary reminder. Anything can happen until the last EVM blinks. We have to wait for the actual count on November 14th.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that these projections of stability hold up. We need to move beyond just the headline numbers now and really dissect the strategy, the political math, the messaging, everything that went into constructing this projected victory for the NDA. The sources suggest this wasn't just luck, it was, quote, a carefully calibrated symphony.
Symphony is a good word for it.
Yeah.
Or maybe social engineering. Look, the sources consistently define Bihar politics as the art of the alliance. It's become a refined science of putting together coalitions. And the NDA, this time around combining Nitish Kumar's JDU, the BJP, Chirag Paswan's LJP-RV, and Jitan Ram Manji's HAMI, they managed to stitch together what they proudly called a rainbow coalition of castes.
A rainbow coalition. Okay, let's break down the different colors in that rainbow, starting with the foundation, the most consistent part.
Right, the foundation, the bedrock that remains Nitish Kumar's JDU. As we discussed, he seems to have maintained his decades-long, absolutely critical hold over those extremely backward classes, EBCs, and also the non-Yadav OBCs. That group, remember, is maybe close to 30% of the electorate. They provide that core stability, that anchor against the bigger national political tides.
Okay, so the EBCs bring the stability. Who brings the sort of power surge and the aspirational appeal?
Well, that's clearly the role of the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP. They mobilized their traditional base, the upper caste voters, naturally. But their expansion seems to have come from two key areas. First, successfully connecting with that rapidly growing group of first-time voters and the aspirational, often urban, youth. These voters are perhaps less tied to traditional caste loyalties and more focused on development, jobs, infrastructure.
And the second area for the BJP?
The second is just sheer organizational power and the national leadership factor. They bring the resources, the disciplined cadre, and of course, the Modi factor.
Right. And then there's the Dalit vote. Always crucial, often fragmented, and hard to capture reliably. How did the NDA manage that?
Yes, this was vital. Bringing Chirag Paswan's LJP-RV firmly into the fold seems to have paid off handsomely, according to the polls. Chirag Paswan successfully leveraged his late father Ram Vilas Paswan's considerable legacy among the Dalit communities, particularly the large Paswan group. This appears to have consolidated a critical vote share for the NDA in potentially 40, maybe even 50 constituencies, where the Dalit vote can be the deciding factor. And then you have Jitan Ram Manji's HFM party adding another layer, particularly among the Mahad elites. It creates this quite complex cross-caste pyramid.
It sounds like a mathematical equation almost, but isn't a coalition like that inherently fragile? I mean, you've got the BJP's traditional upper caste base and Chirag Paswan's Dalit base. Historically, they haven't always seen eye to eye. What was the glue holding this rainbow together on the ground? How did the sources explain how they all ended up seemingly voting for the same team?
That's an excellent question, a necessary challenge to the narrative. The sources suggest the glue was really twofold. First, tangible governance delivery. Things like roads, electricity, access to welfare schemes, these benefited people across caste lines, creating a shared positive experience of the government's work. Second, and perhaps just as important, was a unified narrative of anti-chaos, a shared opposition to the memory, however distant, of the jungle Raj.
So less about warm, fuzzy unity and more about pragmatic benefit and a common enemy.
Exactly. The NDA strategy, which they branded as Samajik Samrasa or social harmony, wasn't necessarily about deep emotional bonds between these groups. It was more like a highly functional political algorithm. It guaranteed, or at least promised, mutual benefits development for all and security from a perceived past chaos. That practical calculation seems to have overridden some of the historical social tensions, at least electorally.
And this broad functional algorithm stood in stark contrast to the opposition's math, right?
It did. The NDA cast a very wide net, socially speaking. This meant that any anti-incumbency sentiment that existed likely got splintered among different groups, rather than consolidating behind one opposition force. This structure looks much sturdier electorally than the Mahagathbandhan's heavy reliance on its strong but relatively narrow Yadav Muslim core vote bank. That's a powerful base, roughly 32% of the electorate, maybe a bit more. But its narrowness made the MGB vulnerable if the NDA could successfully peel away smaller communities or consolidate the non-Yadav, non-Muslim vote, which it seems they did.
Okay, let's move up to the leadership level. The sources universally describe the NDA campaign as this well-oiled two-engine machine. You've got Nitish Kumar's long track record in state governance running alongside Prime Minister Modi's national charisma and power.
Yes, this partnership, which has certainly had its ups and downs over the years.
Understatement.
Yes. But it seems to have become this, well, institutionalized, highly pragmatic model now. It effectively combines developmental efficiency at the state level with national resonance and resource mobilization. You have Nitish Kumar, the veteran administrator. He's still seen by many as Sushashan Babu, the good governance man. He personifies stability, sticking to the rules, focusing on local delivery, summarized in their slogan Vikas Aur Niyam, development and rule of law. He's the familiar, trusted local face.
But hang on, his political career has been famous for, let's say, flexibility in alliances. He's switched partners multiple times. How do voters, especially those core supporters, reconcile that perceived political instability with his image as the Sushashan Babu, the man of stability?
That's a fascinating psychological puzzle, and the sources offer an interesting take. It seems that many voters, particularly perhaps those EBC and women voters we talked about, have kind of internalized his political shifts not as opportunism, but as pragmatism. His survival instinct, his ability to switch alliances to stay in power, is viewed by some not as personal ambition, but almost as a commitment to ensuring that Bihar's development trajectory continues uninterrupted, the thinking goes. He'll align with whoever, whether it's the BJP or previously the RJD, can best secure the resources and political stability needed for the state's growth. It's seen as putting Bihar first, even if it means political contortions.
Pragmatism, not opportunism. An interesting interpretation. And that state-level pragmatism is then powerfully complemented by the national weight of Narendra Modi.
Exactly. Modi acts as the emotional anchor, the charismatic national figurehead. His campaign rallies and messaging successfully blend several powerful themes. High-level nationalism, appeals to national pride, showcasing big-ticket central government infrastructure projects that benefit Bihar, and emphasizing the expansion of central welfare schemes like the PM Awas Yojana for housing or Ayushman Bharat for health insurance. He brings the big picture, the national connection.
So it's the seamless blending of the macro and the micro narratives. The sources call it Delhi's power and Patna's pragmatism.
That synthesis seems to be their killer app, their unique selling proposition. It simultaneously offers the comfort of familiar local delivery, Nitish, and the aspirational pull of being connected to a rising India, Modi. And, crucially, it deliberately contrasts this package with the perceived chaos and, yes, those potent negative memories of the Jungle Raj era. That's a narrative the NDA consistently and very effectively revived throughout the campaign.
Let's just define that term clearly for anyone listening who might not know it. What exactly is Jungle Raj, and why is it still such a powerful political weapon for the NDA even all these years later?
Right. Jungle Raj, it literally translates to rule of the jungle. It's a highly loaded political term, primarily used by the NDA and its supporters to refer to the period of governance in Bihar under the Rashtriya Janata Dal, RJD, mainly Lalu Prasad Yadav's tenure, roughly from 1990 to 2005. It evokes images of a near-total breakdown of law and order, rampant corruption, institutional collapse, high rates of kidnapping for ransom, Mangdari tax, dominance of local strongmen, and a general sense of insecurity and state failure.
A very negative image.
Extremely negative, and it's become a potent political shorthand. The NDA uses it very effectively to frame any potential return of the RJD-led Mahagathbandhan not just as a political change, but as a potential descent back into anarchy and lawlessness. It taps into deep-seated fears, especially among the urban middle class and older voters who remember that period vividly.
Okay, understood. Now, we also need to look closely at the economic messaging. The sources describe it as development as drama. The NDA's 2025 manifesto wasn't just a list of promises. It was presented as this document of audacious modernity.
It really felt like they were trying to shift the goalpost to change the conversation about Bihar's potential. For a state that was so long associated with, frankly, low expectations and backwardness, the NDA laid out this incredibly detailed, quantitative vision of the future. And crucially, it felt aspirational, but also somewhat plausible to the growing middle class and the ambitious youth. This wasn't just about promising more welfare handouts. It was about promising fundamental structural change.
What were some of the most specific, the most audacious promises that anchored this development drama, the ones that really caught the eye?
The sheer scale of the numbers was headline-grabbing. The absolute marquee pledge was the creation of 1 crore new jobs over the next term. A huge number, supposedly achievable through a mix of public sector recruitment drives and, more significantly, attracting large-scale private investment in industry.
1 crore jobs. Wow. What else? Connectivity seemed key.
Absolutely. They promised a revolution in connectivity. 7 new expressways were announced, designed to slash travel times between Bihar cities and major economic centers elsewhere in India, connecting to ports and national corridors, plus 3,600 kilometers of upgraded railway lines.
And airports, too. That feels crucial for integrating Bihar into the modern, faster-paced economy.
Vital. Connectivity is destiny, as they say. The manifesto pledged 4 new international airports, upgrading existing ones or building new ones in key cities. Patna, the capital, but also Darbhanga in the north, Purnia in the east, and Bhagalpur, the Silk City. The vision is clearly to transform Bihar from being seen as a landlocked, inward-looking state into a major transit and logistics hub for eastern India.
The financial commitments mentioned were also huge. They were projecting investment figures that would require a massive economic shift to actually materialize.
Yes, the projected numbers were staggering. Promises to attract a total of 9 lakh crore in investment. That's about, over 100 billion US dollars. This investment was targeted specifically toward developing dedicated industrial corridors, establishing 100 new MSME parks across the state to foster small and medium enterprises, and actively participating in the National Defense Corridor projects to attract high-tech manufacturing. On top of that, they promised to double subsidies for farmers and expand the reach of central schemes like the Kisan Samman Nidhi income support.
And how did this vision contrast with what the opposition, the MGB, was offering?
Well, the sources suggest a stark contrast in framing. The MGB, led by Tejashwi Yadav, certainly focused on the critical issue of jobs promising large-scale government recruitment. But their overall manifesto, according to the analysis, leaned heavily on welfare populism without a detailed fiscal or structural roadmap. It was seen as perhaps less convincing on how these promises would be funded or implemented long-term. The NDA, meanwhile, successfully branded itself as the only credible custodian of Bihar's forward motion, linking their vision of Vikas development directly with the stability, security, and perhaps even the sense of restored pride that the state had regained under their rule. Okay, but let's push back on that Jungle Raj narrative again for a second. We mentioned it taps into older fears, but didn't the sources also suggest that for younger voters, people who didn't live through that era, the immediate pressing issue of massive unemployment might be a much bigger motivator than historical fear? Was that memory tactic really effective across all age groups? That's a really crucial point, and the NDA campaign seems to have recognized that generational divide. You're right. For the youth, the abstract fear of Jungle Raj probably holds less weight than the concrete reality of needing a job, the frustration of migration. So the NDA's strategy was clever, almost bifurcated. They used the Jungle Raj narrative primarily to consolidate their hold on the older demographics and the urban middle-class swing voters groups that prioritize stability and security above all else. It was about neutralizing potential anti-incumbency among those key groups.
And for the youth?
For the youth, they countered the MGB's job promises with their own, even bigger numbers that 1 crore jobs pledge, and crucially, linked it to the tangible, visible symbols of modernization. the expressways, the airports, the industrial parks. It was a direct appeal to aspiration. So they addressed both the present anxiety, unemployment for the young, and the historical fear, chaos, for the older or more security-conscious voters. A two-pronged attack, essentially.
Very strategic. Finally, let's touch upon the ground game, the execution. The sources describe the NDA's campaign machine as having almost military precision.
Yeah, clockwork is another term used. The sources paint a picture of the NDA's organizational machinery operating with incredible precision. It was reportedly a highly data-driven, centrally coordinated campaign, but one that effectively fused that top-down strategy with hyper-local execution. They relied heavily on micro-targeting voters based on demographics and past voting behavior, and then ensuring turnout through their famous page committees.
Page committees. Can you explain what those are?
Sure. A page committee, or Panapramuk system, is a core part of the BJP's, and by extension the NDA's, organizational strategy. Each Panapramuk is a party worker, assigned responsibility for just one page of the electoral roll in their local polling booth, usually covering maybe 30-60 voters, often neighbors or people they know personally. Their job is simple but vital. Maintain contact with those specific families, ensure they understand the party's message, address any concerns, and most importantly, physically ensure they come out to vote on polling day. It's grassroots mobilization at its most granular level.
Wow. So incredible micro-level organization, a clockwork campaign on one side.
Exactly. Versus what the sources describe as the relative chaos and internal fragmentation on the opposition side. And anchoring the NDA's ground message was that simple, powerful question we mentioned. Junga Raj wapas chati ho kya? Do you want the rule of lawlessness back? Just asking that question repeatedly seems to have been enough to revive those negative memories and effectively freeze any significant anti-incumbency momentum among those crucial middle ground swing demographics. It's a stark example of how strategically deploying political memory can be incredibly effective in securing continuity.
Okay, so we've dissected the NDA's apparent success formula. Now we have to turn to the all side of the coin. The Mahagathbandhan, MGB, the main opposition, and also that really high-profile, much-discussed attempt by the strategist-turned-politician Prashant Kishor, or PK, to create a completely new third force with his Suraaj platform. What did the sources tell us about why the opposition seems to have struggled so much?
Well, the narrative around the Mahagathbandhan, the MGB, is primarily one of fatigue and fragmentation. That seems to be the consensus view. Their main leader, Tejashwi Yadav, son of Lalu Prasad Yadav, is undeniably charismatic. He connects with young people, draws huge crowds at his rallies, and his message focused squarely on jobs, which is the #1 issue for many.
So the rallies were big, the energy seemed high.
Yes, but he seems to have suffered from that classic political syndrome. The rally-rich, booth-poor pattern, lots of visible enthusiasm, lots of media attention on the crowds, but apparently it didn't translate effectively into organized votes on polling day.
Meaning the emotional appeal was there, but the organizational muscle to get those supporters to the polling stations and ensure they voted wasn't quite strong enough?
That appears to be the case. The sources suggest that the RJD's core message jobs, social justice, while definitely resonant, felt somewhat diluted. Diluted partly by perhaps some internal party discord or lack of coordination among cadres on the ground, but also, critically, diluted by the NDA's relentless and effective use of those Jungle Raj memories. The opposition was constantly fighting against these ghosts of the past, making it harder to sell their own positive vision for the future.
And what about the other partners in the MGB, the Congress, the left parties?
They seem to have struggled significantly as well. The Congress Party, unfortunately for them, appears to be continuing its long, slow decline in Bihar. Its influence seems to have shrunk even further, confined mostly to certain pockets, particularly among some sections of the Muslim community. The left parties also found it hard to hold on to their traditional, limited areas of strength. The overall picture for the MGB seems to be one where the necessary vote transfer between the different alliance partners just didn't happen effectively. Arithmetic on paper adding up the vote shares of different parties didn't translate into political chemistry on the ground.
Still, even with this projected defeat, the opposition isn't being wiped out entirely, right? The polls suggest they'll still hold a significant number of seats, maybe around 85-90. That's not insignificant.
No, absolutely not. That projected floor of 85 to 90 seats is crucial. It ensures that opposition politics in Bihar remains alive and kicking. It provides a platform, a voice, and a potentially strong check on the ruling government in the assembly. And, the sources also make an interesting historical point here. Political fatigue and defeat in Bihar have sometimes been the catalyst for reinvention. They referenced the great Javakosh Narayan movement, the JP movement back in the 1970s. That emerged from the shadows of what was seen as a corrupt and complacent establishment, and it fundamentally reshaped Indian politics. So while this looks like a setback for the MGB, this period of fatigue could, potentially, be the prelude to a significant future reinvention or realignment on the opposition side. History suggests it's possible.
An interesting perspective. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or perhaps the strategist in the room, Prashant Kishor and his Jan Suraaj movement. He entered the fray with this massive reputation, the master strategist who'd engineered victories across India. Yet the exit polls are predicting a stunning failure for his party, JSP. What are the numbers?
The numbers are brutal, frankly. Across most of the credible exit polls, Jan Suraaj is projected to win somewhere between 0 and 5 seats, maybe even closer to 0. It's a huge disconnect from the hype, the media coverage, the intellectual excitement his campaign generated. The sources are calling it the Great Expectation Gap.
0 to 5 seats. Wow. After all that build-up, the statewide yatra, why such a gap? What happened?
It seems Kishor, the celebrated consultant who masterminded wins for others, found that making the leap to being a successful candidate and party builder himself was just incredibly difficult, especially in a state like Bihar. He undeniably generated enormous intellectual interest, massive social media buzz with his ambitious Jan Suraaj Yatra, his long march across the state. But the sources highlight this fatal disconnect between that digital noise, that media aura, and actual electoral traction on the ground.
So what's the fundamental lesson here about Bihar's political DNA, perhaps? What did Kishore misread?
It seems to be a rather harsh lesson, particularly for technocratic approaches to politics. The lesson is, Bihar's politics, deep down, still runs primarily on the old tracks. It runs on hard-cast arithmetic, deeply entrenched local networks, personal loyalties, and intensive face-to-face persuasion. Much more so than on sophisticated policy papers, data analytics, or even viral digital campaigns.
So he won the hashtag war but lost the ground war.
That seems to be the essence of it. Kishore was brilliant at framing the debate, at raising issues, at capturing the imagination of the commentariat. He was the king of the hashtag, as you say. But the forces confirm quite starkly that in Bihar, hashtags still trail miles behind dedicated, disciplined, booth-level cadre work. He simply didn't have the time, or perhaps the strategy, to build the kind of deep grassroots organizational structure needed to compete with the deeply institutionalized machinery of the established parties like the NDA and the RJD.
Is it fair to completely write off Kishore's movement based on this one election, though? Could this initial, perhaps expected failure just be a necessary first step in a much longer game?
That's a very important nuance. The sources strongly caution against dismissing him entirely just yet. They actually draw an interesting parallel to the early days of the Aam Aadmi Party, AP, in Delhi, which also had some initial electoral setbacks before its breakthrough. The thinking is that JSP's 2025 performance, however poor in terms of seats, might be better viewed as a long-term investment. He's laid down a marker, started building a narrative, potentially created a platform.
A foundation for the future, perhaps?
Possibly. If, say, the current NDA government runs into trouble down the line, if significant public fatigue sets in, or if, and this is a big if, generational change starts to genuinely erode those traditional caste loyalties over the next 5 or 10 years, well then Kishore's explicitly non-aligned, issues-based, governance-focused platform could suddenly look very appealing to a segment of the electorate looking for an alternative.
So he might have lost the sprint this time, but he could still be positioning himself for a marathon run later on.
That's a good way to put it. And arguably, his presence alone has already had an impact. He forced the conversation to some extent to move beyond just caste calculations towards substantive issues of governance, development, and systemic reform. Even if that hasn't translated into seats yet, changing the terms of the debate, well, that's a kind of victory in itself, isn't it? Even if it's not the one he wanted right now.
Okay, let's deepen this analysis of Prashant Kishore's Jan Suraaj now. Moving beyond just the tactical reasons for failure, the lack of ground game, the missing face, the sources frame this in much starker terms. They describe it not just as an electoral loss, but as an existential defeat. What do they mean by that? It sounds quite profound.
It is profound. And that term, existential defeat, really captures the essence of the critique. When you synthesize the analysis across different sources, Kishore's failure wasn't just about political mechanics. It represented a fundamental ideological misalignment with the sort of psychological and cultural currents driving contemporary Indian politics, particularly in the Hindi heartland. Kishore approached politics very explicitly as a technocratic exercise. It was all about data, optimal messaging, efficient delivery, rational policy, essentially. Politics as an engineering problem to be solved. And crucially, it was presented as ideologically neutral.
Okay, a technocratic, neutral approach. And that clash directly with the BJP's approach, which the sources describe as something very different.
Completely different. Diametrically opposed, almost.
Yeah.
The BJP, particularly under Modi and Shah, hasn't just built a political party. They've successfully constructed and propagated a powerful meta-narrative of national resurgence. They frame politics not just as governance, but as a civilizational mission. It's a narrative that skillfully blends deep cultural mythology with highly effective real politics. It draws on historical epics. The sources mention the Ramayana's ideals of duty and valor, the Mahabharata's strategic complexity, and merges them with political philosophy, like Kautilya's ancient treatise on statecraft, the Arthashastra. It offers a comprehensive, resonant vision of national purpose and destiny.
So the pitch isn't just vote for us for better roads and jobs, it's vote for us to participate in the spiritual and historical renewal of India. Can you ground this in some real-world political symbolism? How does this mythic momentum actually translate into something a voter connects with on the ground?
Well, the sources explain it through the deliberate use of archetypes and resonant narratives. The political discourse often subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, portrays Prime Minister Modi not just as a political leader, but in almost quasi-mythological terms. He's sometimes likened to a modern Hanuman, the selfless, devoted warrior serving a higher cause, clearing obstacles, facilitating a larger divine plan.
Hanuman. Wow. And what's the larger plan in this narrative?
The narrative often implies that this political project is paving the way for a restoration of the Dharma, of righteous order. Some interpretations even link it, implicitly or explicitly, to prophecies like the coming of Lord Kalki, the 10th avatar of Vishnu, who, according to scripture, is prophesied to appear at the end of the current dark age, the Kali Yuga, to destroy evil and usher in a new golden age.
Hold on, are you suggesting that mainstream political communication is actually leveraging these deep-seated mythological prophecies, Kalki, the end of the Kali Yuga, to frame electoral campaigns and governance? That seems extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. But the analysis suggests it's happening, often operating at a symbolic or subconscious level. It gives voters a powerful sense that they aren't just choosing a party based on manifestos. They're participating in something historically inevitable, maybe even divinely ordained. It imbues everyday political acts, building infrastructure, implementing welfare schemes, asserting national strength with a spiritual dimension. It transforms politics into an act of collective faith, a step towards a destined national greatness.
Okay. So against this sweeping backdrop of epic mythology, national destiny, and spiritual renewal, you have Prashant Kishor, armed with his data, his spreadsheets, his neutral slogans about improving governance systems.
Exactly. He looked, as one source puts it, soulless in a battle of faiths. His failure in this reading wasn't a failure of analysis or strategy in the conventional sense. It was a profound failure to understand the anthropology and the poetry of the society he was trying to lead. He fundamentally misread the cultural zeitgeist, the deep psychological need in a society undergoing rapid, often disorienting change, for moral clarity, for spiritual anchors, for a sense of belonging to a grand, unfolding story.
This connects to a deeper philosophical tension that the sources explore. The contrast between Gandhi's approach and Modi's approach, the Gandhi-Modi dialectic, they call it. Can you elaborate on that? The difference between Gandhi's moral power and Modi's strategic power.
Yes, this is seen as a core intellectual and philosophical cleavage in modern India. Mahatma Gandhi represents the power of ahimsa, nonviolence, satyagraha, truth force, moral persuasion tools that were incredibly effective against an external colonial power that, to some extent, needed to maintain a facade of legitimacy. Modi's model, in contrast, represents a more muscular, assertive nationalism. It's rooted in the idea that moral strength, while important, is insufficient on its own in a harsh world. It must be backed by decisive strategic power, by national strength, by a willingness to use force when necessary to protect national interests.
It's the idea that Ashoka's Dharma needs Chanakya's realism.
Precisely. The governing philosophy seems to be that the noble ideals of Ashoka's Dharma, peace, righteousness, must coexist with and be implemented through the hard-nosed political realism described by Chanakya in the Arthashastra. You need both the moral vision and the practical, sometimes ruthless, statecraft to achieve it.
And the argument is that in today's world, digital, globalized, arguably more dangerous Gandhi's tools are seen by some as less suited to the challenges of modern statecraft.
That's the critique, yes. The sources argue that the modern state operates in an environment where algorithmic propaganda replaces empire, where digital information warfare is constant, and geopolitical competition requires swift, strategic, often power-based responses. In this context, Modi's governing model is often compared to a kind of pragmatic nationalism, perhaps drawing parallels with Deng Xiaoping's approach in China, combining the efficiency of a state-guided market economy with the cohesive power of unified national identity and purpose.
And into this polarized landscape, Kishor tried to build his third pole, something explicitly not nationalist in the BJP sense, but also not aligned with the traditional socialist or caste-based opposition. A purely rational, neutral space based on competence.
And this is where the sources deliver their most biting critique of his strategy. In an age that feels increasingly polarized, driven by deep convictions and strong identities, they argue that the middle ground is not a viable political platform. It's a precipice. It's seen as wishy-washy, lacking conviction. To mobilize people, especially against a powerful incumbent, you arguably need to stand firmly on a foundation of deeply held beliefs, offer a compelling counter-identity. But trying to appeal rationally to everyone, Kishor failed to generate the necessary passion, the fear, the sense of belonging, the mobilization required to challenge a political force powered by such strong conviction and identity politics.
Okay, so this deeper ideological disconnect manifested in specific tactical failures. Let's quickly list the main ones the sources identify for Jan Suraaj.
Right. 4 key tactical failures stemming from this philosophical gap. First, and perhaps most obviously fatal in Bihar, the lack of a face. Bihar's politics is intensely personality-driven. Voters connect with leaders. JSP failed to project a single, clear, charismatic individual as the potential chief minister. Kishor himself remained the strategist, not the face. This created a vacuum, leaving no political oxygen for JSP between the established figures of Nitish Kumar, the Sushashan Babu, and Tejashwi Yadav, the challenger with dynastic appeal. The movement felt abstract, leaderless.
Second, the message itself.
Yes, the absence of emotional messaging. As we discussed, Kishor and Jan Suraaj primarily spoke the language of policy documents, data analysis, governance reforms. It was rational, maybe even admirable in its detail. But the electorate, particularly in the heat of the campaign, responds powerfully to emotion, to symbolism, to narratives of pride, security, identity. His talk of governance reform sounded clinical, sterile, compared to the NDA's potent mix of development promises, national pride, and cultural resonance. He offered prose and a market-demanding poetry.
Third, the organization, or lack thereof.
The organizational vacuum. Despite the high visibility of the Jan Suraaj Yatra, the movement critically lacked a deep, coherent cadre structure on the ground. They simply didn't have that organic, village-level, booth-level network of dedicated volunteers, party workers, affiliated groups. The kind of machinery that the BJP RSS ecosystem, built over decades, provides. You can't realistically defeat such a deeply entrenched machine with goodwill, media mentions, and spreadsheets alone. Politics is still won booth by booth.
And finally, his strategic choice to go it alone.
Yes, the alienation of potential allies, which the sources attribute partly to hubris. His insistence on contesting alone, positioning himself as equidistant from both the NDA and the MGB, alienated potential partners on both the secular left and the nationalist right. Bihar politics is fundamentally about stitching together alliances, often pragmatic ones based on caste, community, and mutual interest. Going solo was seen as strategically naive, perhaps arrogant. One source summed it up with a rather sharp observation on Indian political culture. Ambition without submission to the existing realities is the ultimate sin. To succeed, especially as an outsider, you often need to show some respect for the existing power structures, even as you seek to change them.
So this philosophical defeat carries a very stark, very immediate lesson for anyone thinking about political strategy, especially in places like India.
It really does. Kishor, the ultimate empiricist, the data guy, essentially tried to play chess on a board where everyone else was engaged in a grand mythological reenactment. His cold, rational realism felt utterly lifeless in a theater saturated with divine allegories and appeals to destiny. His defeat serves as a potent, maybe even existential, warning. Technocracy without theology, strategy without myth, may not be enough to inspire or mobilize a nation or a state like Bihar that feels itself being reborn in faith and aspiration.
He was listening for data signals while everyone else was marching to the beat of the drums.
That captures the disconnect perfectly. In a culture that still responds powerfully to the symbolic call of the conch shell, the Shanka silence, however rational, however well-reasoned, ultimately registers as defeat. The voters, it seems, chose a worldview that frames their future within a narrative of destiny and pride. Kishor, by remaining strictly neutral and purely rational, simply failed to speak the deeply felt, resonant language.
Okay, but this political decision, this apparent choice for stability, and this mythic resurgence narrative, it wasn't made in an economic vacuum, was it? It happened against the backdrop of a really profound economic transformation in Bihar. This is a state that, despite facing enormous challenges, poverty, population density, climate vulnerability, has somehow managed to shift gears. It's gone from being the poster child for stagnation, that awful BIMARU tag, to consistently ranking among India's fastest growing state economies. That economic context must have heavily influenced voters' choices.
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental. This is a genuinely remarkable and perhaps still underappreciated story of economic resilience. Bihar carried the weight of that BIMARU label for decades, signifying structural backwardness. But over the last 5 to 10 years, and especially in the post-pandemic period, it has shown surprising economic dynamism. It seems to have effectively leveraged its huge demographic dividend, all those young people, and its extensive welfare architecture to not just recover from shocks, but to achieve significant growth.
Let's zero in on that recent growth arc, say from 2020 to 2025. What does the hard data tell us about the speed and consistency of this economic expansion?
The figures are genuinely impressive, especially considering Bihar's low starting base. Over this specific 5-year period, Bihar's real gross state domestic product, GSDP, that's growth adjusted for inflation, has expanded at a compound annual growth rate, CAGR, of somewhere between 8 and 9%.
8 to 9% per year, that's huge.
It is. And to put that in perspective, that pace is nearly double the state's average growth rate from the decade before the pandemic hit. We have specific, very robust real growth figures reported, plus 10.6% in the fiscal year 2022-23, and another plus 9.2% in 2023-24. That pushed the state's nominal GSDP, the total value of goods and services, produced up to 8.54 lakh crore in that last fiscal year. That's over 100 billion US dollars.
Okay, impressive numbers. What were the main engines driving this? Was it big private industries setting up shop or something else?
Primarily, the growth seems to have been powered by internal factors, rather than a surge in external private investment, although that's starting to pick up. The three main drivers identified are, first, strong rural consumption, which has been significantly supported and stimulated by government welfare transfers and schemes. Second, massive public investment in infrastructure, roads, bridges, electricity grid upgrades. The government has been spending heavily here, and that creates economic activity. And third, linking back directly to our political discussion, the continued strength and expansion of those women-centric welfare programs, like the Javika SHCs providing microcredit and direct cash transfers. Government spending, particularly capital expenditure, has been the primary catalyst.
But the sources are quick to point out the potential fragility here, the contradictions baked into this growth model. It's not all smooth sailing.
Not at all. The description one source used, sprinting but on a treadmill, feels quite apt. There are major vulnerabilities. For instance, agriculture still contributes about a quarter, 24–25% of the state's GSDP, and employs half the workforce. And agriculture remains critically dependent on the monsoon, making the entire economy highly vulnerable to climate change impacts like floods and droughts, which Bihar experiences frequently.
And the migration issue, that's always central to Bihar's economy.
Absolutely central. We have to talk about the paradox of migration. On the one hand, the annual remittances sent back by Biharis working elsewhere in India and abroad are estimated to be massive, possibly exceeding 1 lakh crore, around $12–13 billion per year. This inflow acts as a vital economic safety net, cushioning household incomes, funding consumption, building houses. But on the other hand, those huge remittance flows are a direct reflection of a fundamental problem: the structural lack of sufficient high-quality, well-paying jobs within Bihar itself. People leave because they have to.
That brings us neatly to the catch-up effect discussion. We need to put Bihar's growth in context. How does it compare to the rest of India?
Comparatively, Bihar's recent performance is remarkable. That 9.2% real GSDP growth in 2023-24 actually exceeded the overall Indian national average growth rate, which was 8.2% for the same period. Among the large states, only Assam grew faster. And if you look over the past decade, Bihar's real GSDP has more than doubled. For a large, historically impoverished state, that represents staggering progress in aggregate terms.
The aggregate progress is undeniable. The total economic pie is growing fast. But here comes the major disconnect, the big shadow hanging over this success story, what the sources call the per capita paradox.
Yes, this is where the shiny narrative of high growth collides with the harsh reality on the ground for the average person. Despite the booming GSDP, Bihar's net state domestic product, NSDP, per capita, which is a better measure of individual income, stood at only 32,174 for the fiscal year 2023-24.
32,000 rupees. Let's put that in perspective. How does that compare nationally? You mentioned it's the lowest in India.
It is the lowest, yes. To give you a sense of the gap, the national average NSDP per capita is roughly 96,000 dirhams. So Bihar's per capita income is barely one-third of the Indian average. And compared to richer states like Kerala, it's about one-fifth. This explains why, despite the high GSDP growth headlines, you don't necessarily feel widespread prosperity when you're on the ground in many parts of Bihar. The growth feels abstract at the household level.
Why? Why is this gap so incredibly persistent? If the overall economy is growing at 9–10%, why isn't individual income catching up faster?
The core reason is structural dilution caused by rapid population growth. Bihar's population expanded by a huge 18.2% between the 2011 and 2021 censuses. That's far, far higher than the Indian average population growth rate of around 11.7% during the same period. So the economic pie is indeed getting bigger, quite rapidly. But the number of people needing a slice of that pie is growing even faster.
So the growth dividend gets spread incredibly thinly.
Exactly. The aggregate economy is expanding, which is good, but individual prosperity, the average slice size, is growing much more slowly because the denominator, the population, keeps increasing so quickly. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. The state is generating more wealth, but it's struggling to outpace population growth enough to significantly lift average incomes closer to the national level.
Okay, that context is crucial. Let's look at the mechanics of the growth itself. The sources break it down using a tri-engine framework. What are the three specific engines that have been driving this economic turnaround and presumably validating the ruling alliance's claim to delivering development?
Right, the tri-engine model provides a useful structure. The first, and perhaps most visible engine, has been the infrastructure renaissance. This has been a massive focus area for the government for nearly 2 decades. Road density, for example, has reportedly tripled since 2005. All-weather roads now connect far more villages to markets and administrative centers, which has a huge economic multiplier effect.
And the other really critical piece of infrastructure, power.
Absolutely vital. The improvement in power availability has been genuinely transformational for Bihar. Back in 2005, the state could barely meet 500 millidardo of its peak demand. There were widespread, long power cuts daily. Today, the state reportedly meets its peak demand of over 6,500 millidardo, ensuring relatively reliable electricity supply for maybe 18 to 22 hours a day, even in many rural areas. This has been a game changer for small businesses, for students studying at night, for basic quality of life. It moved Bihar out of the literal dark ages.
Okay, infrastructure is engine one. What's the second? This links back to the politics.
Engine number 2 is welfare and empowerment, particularly focused on women. Those schemes we discussed earlier, like the Mukhyamantri Cycle Yojana for schoolgirls, the Kanya Uttan Yojana providing financial assistance for girls' education and health. These haven't just been social safety nets. They've been designed as structural economic interventions. They've boosted female literacy and labor force participation, delayed marriage age, and importantly, put money directly into the hands of women, which tends to boost household consumption and investment in children. The scale is huge. Direct cash transfers reaching 1.4 crore women, plus the microcredit flowing through the Jivika self-help groups. This has sustained consumption-led growth, especially during economic downturns.
And the third engine. This brings us back to that paradox.
The third engine is the migration and remittance economy. As we noted, that massive annual inflow of over 1 lakh crore from Biharis working elsewhere acts like a huge parallel economic support system. It keeps the rural economy liquid, funds consumption, fuels a lot of the local housing construction you see. It's undeniably crucial for stability. But the long-term policy challenge, the big question facing the re-elected government, is how to transition away from reliance on remittances. How do you convert that vital external income into sustainable, productive internal employment opportunities into local industries and enterprises so that the next generation doesn't have to migrate out of compulsion? That's the structural transformation Bihar still needs to achieve.
All right, let's dive even deeper now into the specific sectors that are actually powering this economic story. The picture painted by the sources isn't just about aggregate growth, it's about diversification. They talk about a sectoral symphony where traditional agriculture provides the underlying rhythm, industry is starting to add the structural bass notes, and the services sector is really soaring, providing the melody.
It's a good analogy. We absolutely have to start with agriculture. Despite all the talk of diversification, farming and allied activities remain the fundamental backbone of Bihar's economy and society. It still sustains roughly half the state's workforce. Think about that, 1 in 2 workers, and contributes a very significant 24% of the state's gross state value added, GSVA. It's the foundation.
And how is this foundational sector performing? Is it stagnant, or is there growth and modernization happening here too?
It's definitely not stagnant, though growth can be volatile due to the monsoon. Real growth in agriculture has been averaging somewhere between 2.6% and 5.7% annually over the last 5 years. But within that, certain subsectors are showing real dynamism. Fisheries, for example, have been growing very strongly, around 7.7% annually, thanks to government support for modernization, new ponds, better feed, etc.
What are the big government initiatives aimed at stabilizing and boosting this crucial sector? You mentioned climate vulnerability earlier.
Yes, tackling water management is key. Major irrigation projects are underway or planned. The ambitious Kosi-Mechi interlinking project, for instance, aims to transfer surplus water from the Kosi River Basin to the Mahananda Basin, potentially providing stable irrigation to vast tracts of land in North Bihar, mitigating both floods and droughts in different areas. That's a long-term game changer if fully implemented. Alongside that, direct income support through schemes like the central government's PM Kisan provides a safety net for farmers. And critically, there's a major policy push towards diversification into allied activities, dairy farming, poultry, fisheries, horticulture. The aim is to make farming less reliant on just staple crops like rice and wheat and turn it into a multi-income rural enterprise. The state wants these allied sectors to eventually contribute up to 30% of the total agricultural GSVA.
Okay, so agriculture is evolving, becoming more diversified. Let's move to the industry and manufacturing sector. The sources describe this as more of a rebirth than an invention, suggesting it's recovering from a long period of neglect.
That's a fair assessment. Bihar historically had very little industrial base post-independence. The industry sector, which includes manufacturing and construction, contributes a much smaller share to the state's economy, maybe around 17–18% of GSVA. But its growth trajectory is picking up speed. Real growth here has been averaging a quite respectable 6.9% to 8.6% annually. Manufacturing itself grew by 8.2% in the last reported fiscal year. A lot of this, admittedly, has been driven by the construction boom linked to all the government infrastructure spending we talked about, roads, bridges, buildings.
But is genuine manufacturing, producing goods, starting to take root? What policies are finally managing to attract some industrial investment to Bihar, which was always seen as a difficult place to do business?
There seems to be some progress. The key drivers appear to be, first, that vastly improved, stable power supply. You simply can't run factories without reliable electricity. Second, significant administrative reforms aimed at improving the ease of doing business. The state government introduced the Bihar Industrial Investment Promotion Policy, which includes things like a streamlined single-window clearance system for approvals, and the creation of district-level land banks to make it easier for companies, especially small and medium enterprises, MSMEs, to find and acquire land for factories. These signal a greater seriousness about attracting investment.
And are we seeing this translate into specific industrial clusters starting to form in particular regions?
Yes, some geographical specialization is becoming visible, according to the sources. You're seeing the traditional textile and apparel hubs around Bhagalpur, famous for its silk, being revived and modernized. Leather and footwear units are developing in places like Muzaffarpur, and significant investment is going into food processing plants, logically located near the agricultural belts, particularly around Patna and Nalanda. The strategic goal is clearly to leverage Bihar's huge, relatively low-cost labor force and its agricultural base to become a labor-rich, cost-efficient manufacturing hub for eastern India, perhaps attracting industries looking for alternatives to more congested or expensive regions. The government has set some very ambitious targets for this sector, haven't they? Are they realistic? The targets are certainly audacious, reflecting the high degree of confidence, perhaps buoyed by the election projections. The state aims for the manufacturing sector alone to eventually contribute 25% of GSDP. That would be a massive structural shift. To get there, the manifesto promised interventions aimed at generating up to 1 crore new jobs, linking back to that headline, promised partly through planned investments in 10 dedicated industrial parks per district, and also by trying to attract investment related to the National Defense Production Corridor. It's a hugely ambitious vision. Industry is seen as the necessary structural trunk that needs to strengthen the entire economic tree.
Okay, so if agriculture is the roots and industry is the trunk, then the services sector is where the tree is really branching out and bearing fruit. The sources describe this as Bihar's economic wings.
That's right. The services sector is unequivocally the soaring growth engine of Bihar's economy right now. It contributes the lion's share of economic value, around 57–58% of GSVA, and employs a significant and growing portion of the workforce, about 29%. And crucially, it's recording the highest growth rates by far. Real growth in services has averaged between 6.4% and a whopping 10.8% annually, peaking at that 10.8% mark in 2023-24. This sector is where Bihar's quiet digital transformation and urbanization are most visible.
Which specific parts of the services sector are driving these huge growth numbers?
It's primarily driven by three broad categories. First, transport, storage, and communication, fueled by that infrastructure boom. Road transport activity has reportedly tripled in recent years. Second, banking and financial services. And third, public administration, defense, and other services, which includes government spending.
Let's break those down. The transport growth is linked to the new infrastructure.
Directly. All those new roads, bridges, and critically, the planned upgrades like the 4 new international airports and the 7 new expressways we mentioned earlier. These aren't just about moving people within Bihar. They are strategically positioning the state as a potential transit and logistics hub connecting eastern India, Nepal, and the rest of the country. That drives growth in transport, warehousing, and related services.
And the financial services growth, that must be linked to the digital push.
Absolutely. The massive push for financial and digital inclusion through schemes like Jandalan Yojana, basic bank accounts for all, the rapid adoption of UPI for digital payments, and expanding banking networks has dramatically increased access to financial services. Banking and insurance grew by a strong 12.5% in the last fiscal year alone. Alongside this, there's also significant public investment trying to boost the tourism sector, leveraging Bihar's incredibly rich historical and religious sites, the Buddhist circuit, Bodh Gaya, Nalanda, the Ramayana circuit, the Jain circuit. This generates decentralized employment in hospitality, transport, and retail across the state.
And this rapid services growth seems perfectly aligned with Bihar's biggest asset, its young population.
It really does. With 58% of Bihar's population under the age of 30, the services sector is the ideal engine to absorb this demographic dividend. It requires education, skills, connectivity, things the youth aspire to. This sector is projected by economists to sustain a high growth rate, potentially 10–12% CAGR over the medium term. If that happens, Bihar's services economy alone could potentially exceed $100 billion by 2030. That massive young population isn't just a challenge, it's the ultimate resource fueling this engine.
Okay, let's look ahead now to the future horizon, 2025-2030. Based on these sectoral trends, what's the optimistic economic scenario for Bihar if the political stability holds? And what are the biggest threats that could derail this progress?
The optimistic scenario, assuming continued political stability and effective policy implementation, projects that Bihar's nominal GSDP could continue growing at a very rapid clip, maybe 13–14% CAGR, which translates to roughly 8–10% real growth after inflation. The state government's own budget forecasts aim for a nominal GSDP of 10.97 lakh crore by the fiscal year 2025-26. If this momentum continues, fueled by structural reforms and growing investor confidence, some analysts project that Bihar's economy could potentially cross the $219 billion mark by 2030–31. That would fundamentally change its weight and perception within the Indian economy.
A potential $200 billion plus economy by the end of the decade. That's a staggering transformation from the BIMARU days. But we have to acknowledge the serious risks, the structural challenges that could throw a wrench in the works.
Absolutely. The path is not guaranteed, and the challenges are significant. They require continuous, disciplined governance. First, there's the issue of the state's debt burden. It's projected to approach 37% of GSDP by 2025-26, which is quite high, and could constrain the government's ability to keep spending heavily on infrastructure and welfare in the future. Fiscal consolidation will be necessary. Second, climate volatility remains a huge threat. The annual cycles of devastating floods in the north and severe droughts in the south disrupt agriculture, damage infrastructure, and displace people, acting as a constant drag on growth and requiring massive relief expenditure. And the biggest structural challenge, perhaps the most crucial one, is managing the transition from an economy primarily driven by state-led consumption, essentially, government spending and welfare transfers fueling demand, to one driven by sustainable private sector production, robust growth in manufacturing and market-driven services that create durable, well-paying jobs. That requires attracting significantly more private investment, improving skills, and fostering a more dynamic entrepreneurial ecosystem.
So, Bihar's journey forward is really about graduating from recovery and catch-up to genuinely claiming prosperity for its people.
That captures it perfectly. The re-elected NDA government faces the immense task of balancing its huge demographic dividend, leveraging the energy of its youth with disciplined fiscal management and effective governance. If they can successfully convert those ambitious policy pronouncements into reality on the ground, turn those manifesto promises into actual factories, jobs, and rising incomes, then Bihar truly has the potential to emerge as the economic phoenix of northern India, rewriting the economic geography of the entire nation. But the execution has to match the aspiration.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. We've tracked the projected political outcome, that apparent mandate for stability, and we've explored the underlying economic engine, the story of rapid growth and rising aspiration. Let's try to synthesize these two powerful threads now. What's the core message coming out of this confluence of politics and economics in the 2025 Bihar election, according to the sources?
The essential unifying takeaway seems to be this. The 2025 verdict, as projected by the exit polls, looks like a deeply pragmatic choice by the electorate. A choice for predictable, tested governance over experimental disruption or untested promises.
Pragmatism over novelty.
Precisely. By apparently voting overwhelmingly to re-elect the established NDA alliance, voters seem to be making a calculated bet. They're betting that the known leadership, the Nitish Modi combine, are the safest pair of hands to steer Bihar through this ongoing, complex, and still quite fragile economic transformation, without rocking the boat too much, without introducing political instability or chaos. They appear to have chosen the perceived stability of known governance over the uncertainty of untested promises, whether those promises came from Tejaswi Yadav's MGB or Prashant Kishor's more technocratic outsider model.
We touched upon the digital battleground earlier, the war of narratives playing out on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and YouTube. Did this online sphere ultimately shape the outcome, or was it more of an echo chamber reflecting existing divisions?
Well, social media is undeniably a vibrant, necessary part of the political landscape in Bihar now. It's a space where, particularly the youth, debate ideas, express aspirations, air grievances, and you saw competing narratives flourishing there. NDA supporters relentlessly framed their side as the architect of order and development. MGB supporters highlighted issues of developmental fatigue, unemployment, and demanded social justice. And Prashant Kishor's JSP tried to position itself as the rational, people's technocrat alternative to traditional politics.
But did the online noise translate into offline votes? That seems to be the crucial question, especially regarding Kishor's campaign.
Yes. And the core lesson, reinforced starkly by Prashant Kishor's projected failure despite his massive online presence, remains the same. The sources consistently confirm that in Bihar, hashtags still trail far behind hard, grinding groundwork. Digital popularity, online engagement, viral trends. They still don't automatically or seamlessly translate into electoral success. It confirms the enduring power of the traditional factors: caste arithmetic, community networks, personal relationships, and intensive physical, booth-level mobilization over purely digital campaigning. The ground game still reigns supreme.
Interestingly, though, even with this apparent political repetition, the same alliance seemingly returned to power. The sources emphasize that Bihar itself is undergoing profound structural changes beneath the surface.
Absolutely. This is a critical point. Regardless of the election outcome, the state is fundamentally evolving. Powerful forces like urbanization, even if slower than elsewhere, rising female education levels, the sheer scale and impact of mass migration, both internal and international, and increasing digital connectivity. These are creating entirely new social dynamics, new aspirations, new tensions that the political system will inevitably have to grapple with.
And the sources suggest the locus of future political change might shift.
Yes, there's a fascinating, almost futuristic speculation in some analyses. They posit that the next major political revolution or transformation in Bihar might not originate from the traditional centers of power, like protests on the streets of Patna. Instead, it might emerge more quietly, more organically from the interconnected networks being forged by smartphones in Purnea, coaching centers for competitive exams in Gaya, and remittance networks linking Dubai directly to villages in Darbhanga. These are becoming the new crucibles of aspiration, information exchange, and potentially organized political consciousness.
So Bihar presents this intriguing paradox. On the surface, it appears to be repeating its political history, re-electing the incumbents. But underneath, it's constantly rewriting its own social and economic reality.
Exactly. And that ongoing rewriting process brings us to the final, unavoidable challenge for the victorious alliance, assuming the polls are correct: the equity imperative. There's a very real risk, highlighted in the sources, of Bihar developing a dangerous two-speed economy. a scenario where the major urban centers Patna, Gaya, Muzaffarpur, Bhagalpur accelerate rapidly, benefiting from the big infrastructure projects, the services boom, and growing connectivity. While simultaneously, large parts of the rural hinterland, particularly the flood-prone agricultural districts in the north or the drought-prone areas in the south, get left further behind.
Widening inequality, basically. So the ultimate test for the re-elected NDA government isn't just maintaining high GSDP growth, but ensuring that growth is inclusive.
It has to be. The challenge is to translate that impressive aggregate GSDP expansion into tangible improvements in dignity, opportunity, and quality of life for everyone, especially the most vulnerable. The sources evocatively mention the mason, the migrant, and the mother. That requires policies focused on deeply inclusive urbanization, not just benefiting the cities, ensuring investment and basic services reach the periphery, developing climate-resilient agriculture, and, critically, making a concerted effort towards population stabilization through better education and healthcare. Because without that, the hard-won benefits of economic growth risk being perpetually diluted, especially for the poorest. Bihar's ability to successfully balance its enormous demographic potential with equitable distribution and disciplined governance will truly define its success story over the next decade.
This has been an incredibly rich and detailed deep dive. We've explored the projected massive mandate for the NDA, seemingly driven by that potent mix of social coalition building, the crucial female vote, and the stability narrative. We've analyzed the stark failure of the opposition, particularly the technocratic middle ground experiment of Prashant Kishor, and we've contextualized all of this within Bihar's genuinely remarkable, though still fragile, economic turnaround. The voters, it seems, have opted for the argument that stability is the prerequisite for continued aspiration.
And digging through these sources, it feels like there's a deeper, perhaps more philosophical implication here that resonates beyond just Bihar. The state, in many ways, symbolizes the miracle of democratic resilience, this ability of what was once India's poorest, most seemingly hopeless state to somehow dream big, to aim high, and to actually start climbing that economic ladder. But, and this is the crucial but, the political success driving this seems built so squarely on the effective deployment of myth, ideology, symbolism, and historical narrative by the NDA. While the failure of the alternative, represented by Prashant Kishor, seems rooted in its reliance on pure, unadulterated technocracy.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a rather profound and perhaps unsettling question, particularly for anyone interested in the future of politics and leadership, especially in the developing world.
The question is this: does the future of large-scale democracy, especially in societies undergoing the kind of rapid, sometimes turbulent modernization that India is experiencing, increasingly require leaders to master the art of myth-making before they master the spreadsheet? And when voters are presented with a stark choice, is the inherent preference for stability, for order over perceived chaos, always going to win out against the appeal of a purely rational, evidence-based, technocratic alternative, an alternative that might, however unfairly, be perceived as lacking soul, lacking connection to deeper cultural narratives? That's the provocative thought we want to leave you with as Bihar and India await the final definitive count on November 14th.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Bihar's compelling dual narrative, the politics of stability intertwined with the economics of aspiration. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into the data streams shaping our world.